They were the Ramsinghania Radio and Electric Company of Karachi before they were the Ramsay Brothers of Bombay. That was before partition, when radio engineer F.U. Ramsinghania's name was too difficult for the British of undivided India to pronounce. They started calling him Mr. Ramsay, out of convenience, a name that would be later known in Indian cinema for the family-run cottage industry of screen horror from the lower reaches of the Bombay film industry. If you are a Hindi cine lover and not living under the rocks, you would have surely come across these low-budget, distinctly distinguishable horror films that created a niche market for itself and gained its path in pop culture. And yet, little is known about the production practices of the Ramsay Brothers, their casting process, internal star systems, or the BNC-centric markets that their films cater to. In this video, we try to explore some of those hidden facts, follow the rise of Ramsay family to prominence in the 70s, and the associated politics of Real and Real. This is also a tribute to the Ramsays, the first family of Indian horror. Their moments of kitsch and cliches that often met with condescending responses in undeserving ways. Before delving into the Ramsay films, let's first find out where it all began. Mr. Ramsinghania moved from Karachi to Bombay post-partition and launched a much smaller showroom of electric goods opposite Apsara Cinema. The name Ramsay had stuck with him by then. It was a time when ad hoc film financiers were earning big bucks in the industry in a quick turnaround time. The idea was speedy production of small-scale films that could circulate outside the central exhibition networks and thus get the investments to move faster. These were not 35mm films playing at the metros, but 16mm productions which could still work on the older projection systems which small towns and rural markets depended on. F.U. Ramsay decided to become an ad hoc financier around the same time, but mind you, it was not horror he started with. It started with a number of over-budget, underperforming dramas like Shahid-e-Azam Bhagat Singh, Rustam Sorab and Ek Nanhi Munhi Ladki Thi. It was a particular sequence in this film, Ek Nanhi Munhi Ladki Thi, starring Prithviraj Kapoor and Shatrughan Sinha, that the groundbreaking idea dawned on the Ramsay family. The film, which met with an otherwise cold response from the audience, got them to stand up and notice a nighttime heist scene by Prithviraj Kapoor. Kapoor, putting on a hideous costume, goes into a museum to steal something. And when the police arrive, there's this scene of him suddenly jumping in front of the camera that shocked the audience and made them scream. The film failed at the box office, but the idea evolved. Why don't we make a full-fledged horror movie? The brothers wondered, thus starting a new chapter in the history of Indian cinema. So the brothers started hastily training themselves into concepts of filmmaking. They arranged for a cast, packed everyone into a bus, and went out for the governor's house in Mahabaleshwar. Shyam and Tulsi Ramsay took over direction. Gangu would manage the camera, while Keshu did the lighting. Kumar wrote the scenes, Kiran managed sound, and Arjun was in charge of post-production and editing. And then there was Mother Ramsay cooking for everyone in the unit. The entire process reminded of a picnic. We later hear Tulsi Ramsay remember as the family insiders called it Tiffin Box Productions. Key scenes were shot in the local graveyard using the backdrop of Mahabaleshwar hills, woods and cold nights. And then, well before time and within a budget of 6 to 7 lakhs only, Do Gaz Zameen Ke Niche in 1972 was made, in which a temptress murders a man for his feudal wealth only to wonder if he has actually died. The film and all other upcoming projects by Ramsays owed heavily to the British Hammer horror films that were pretty popular around then. And yet they retained some notable motives for the audience back home, like comic reliefs, romantic side plots with songs and dance, and a unique combination of sex and violence. Do Gaz Zameen Ke Niche emerged as a surprise hit in its first weekend, with full houses in the limited territories where it released. Deals were signed for new distributions across the nation, with loud publicity campaigns that covered the alleys, theatres, pan shops, and a 30-minute special preview on Vivid Bharati by voice artist Sheel Kumar around midnight. The nation heard in trepidation Kumar saying, "Close your doors." close your windows. Then there would be sounds of the heroine screaming. From then on, the Ramsay Brothers averaged nearly one film for every year in the business till the early 1990s. Orcon, Sannata, Purana Mandir, Dak Bangla, Purani Haveli, Shaitani Ilaka, Band Darwaze and Veerana, to name a few. The brothers had struck a chord with the nation, a nation that was undergoing political instability that would eventually lead to the emergency 3 years down the line after Do Gaz Zameen Ke Neeche released. The period of emergency in India involved immense violence and glaring human rights violations, and from there emerged two lasting legacies of Indian cinema that run strong even today. The Angry Young Man Standing Against the System, popularized by Amitabh Bachchan, and the nexus of sex and violence that Ramsay films repeatedly focused on. So many times you will find a feudal landlord and his daughter being subjected to acts of violence in Ramsay films, whether it is a predator like Vikram in Purani Haveli, or the Haveli monster who gropes the woman much like a human being. The violations of the hypersexualized woman body, as we find in Ramsay films, might have more subtle and slicker presentations down the line, but looking from the context of a country under emergency rule and colossal political instability, these films contribute to its time and space. Interestingly, it isn't only the hypersexualized female who is preyed upon in all Ramsay films. In Veerana, we have a witch who possesses the body of Jasmine, the Thakur's daughter, to lure lonely men and thus avenge herself. Now, this motive of possession has its own socio-political context, a tool that allows the female to transgress gendered perspectives and have a greater sense of liberty that is otherwise unreachable. As researcher Barbara Creed suggests, possession becomes the excuse of legitimizing a display of aberrant feminine behavior, which is depicted as depraved, monstrous, abject, and perversely appealing. In Purana Mandir, we watch Puneet Issar flanking his topless torso as his love interest rests a female gaze on his body. In Band Darwaza, Kunika expresses her uninhibited feelings over the phone. While your highbrow notion might discard the tacky presentation, how about considering the way Ramsays led voice to female desire in the ever-prudish Hindi film industry? Remember that the consumer of these films wasn't the urban mass exposed to the Western world, but rural circuits where such motives of liberation in the pretext of possession must have their unique impact on the feminine image. It is also the monstrous depiction of the feudal that one can easily identify with the Ramsay films. A modern car breaks down near an old colonial Haveli. A boy and a girl in western clothing, calling each other darling or baby, get down from the car, wondering what to do next. And then they slowly walk towards the Haveli in search of some shelter, food, and human presence. Well, how many times have you seen something similar in a Ramsay movie? Too many to even distinguish from each other, right? It is in this Haveli that they will be met by a monster or a vampire, someone from the past carrying the nation's feudal legacy. Now look beyond the excesses of sex, latex and violence. The subtext of this past preying on the present gets evident, as you will find in so many Ramsay films. A present that wishes to conform to the Western sense of modernity and progressiveness. A modernity that is represented in their clothes, accents, names, characteristics or choice of music. Take notice and you will find the young protagonists of the Ramsay films often dream into a disco or pop number before they get caught in the Havelis. Now, how does modern counter the feudal past? Not science, not progressive thinking, but always through religious motives like a trident or tabiz. This religious iconography was, however, bereft of any fundamentalism. The crosses or the curses are more cultural motives without vested interests, as will be prevalent in the future. That too is to be considered as a representation of the time and space these films belong to. One might wave off the Ramsay films as clumsy counterfeit versions of the American or British parallels. But a closer look will reveal how these films captured the pulse of a nation caught between pseudo-modernity and culturally rooted traditions. And only when these conflicting ideas join hands, the beast could be defeated. Defeated in real, but how about real? Perhaps the answer lies in what we have around us today. Coverage of the Ramsay films in filmfare, almost everywhere else, has been from a sense of superiority, discarding them as laughable stuff. Laughable it might well be, but can we really ignore the cliches and stereotypes that the Ramsays used to convey their message and politics, although perhaps unintentionally? In his remarkable essay supporting the efforts of Ramsays, we find Roscoe Mendo's mention. What appears to the critic as a worn-out scene is what actually is in reality, and thus it is no use staging an elaborate sequence which might be extraordinary to look at, abstract, but where the fear is not palpable. Horror is a tangible commodity, and it is necessary for audience to perceive the cause of their terror before they understand it. Throughout the 70s and the 80s, the Ramsay family walked against the industry's ideas of cultural legitimacy and white-collar respectability. The seven brothers not only derived from Indian cinema at its origin, like we had in rural road shows or traveling cinema, but also revived memories of joint family cinema that goes back to the pioneer efforts of ЛИКЕ. When they finally faded out of the theaters around the 90s, there was still something more for them to offer. The 364-episode Z Horror show that still stands as one of the most popular shows of Indian television. And then, the more sophisticated horrors took over, both in real and real. Thanks to the extensive research and interviews by the likes of Karthik Nair, whose essays have contributed significant material for this video, the legacy of Ramsays are not yet forgotten. The Academy Award-nominated duo of Sushmit Ghosh and Rintu Thomas also worked on a short documentary on the Ramsays that duly celebrates this first family of Indian horror. And here's our take to add to this very short list of tribute. Hope you enjoyed this video. That is all from us today. If you like this video, please subscribe the channel and share this video.